All right, welcome back to DOGE Watch. Today we're going to be talking about a couple of things. One, we're going to be talking about how DOGE is not just cutting like DEI contracts, which you absolutely have to get rid of, but it's also scrutinizing some of the administrative costs that have been associated with a lot of these costs, or excuse me, associated with a lot of these contracts, because you would be fascinated to find not only what is going into bad policy, but the amount of administrative overhead that is also associated with these contracts. In addition to that, we also know that some of the things that DOGE is working on right now is laying the groundwork for some difficult missions ahead, especially with things like the Department of Defense, which we all know is coming down the pike sooner rather than later. But I also want to get into another episode that happened, and this was some stuff that was uncovered through DOGE with respect to FEMA grants, because whereas DOGE uncovered some really important problems that were taking place, I think there's actually been a misinterpretation of what the problem actually was. And here's what's important. We need to get very, very furious with the way that some of these bureaucracies have been operating, but we need to understand the nature of the problem, because one of the things that is going to be concerning to me as time goes on with this is that there are going to be some people that are faithful within the government trying to help DOGE accomplish its mission, and then there's going to be other people that are working against them. There's going to be some people that claim to be working with DOGE and who talk a really good game, but one of the ways that they will actually divert attention from themselves onto others is that these are the bureaucrats that are the best at playing the blame game. And so one of the things I want us all to be very, very clear on is when we're getting information that DOGE is putting out, or when we're getting information that the government is pointing out, we want to make sure that we properly understand the problems that are being addressed and how they're being addressed. And we never want to create a situation where the bureaucrats that have just gotten really good at shifting blame are the ones that get protected because they're the ones leaking out bad information, right? We've got some good people in there that are working with DOGE. Those are the ones that we want to elevate. All of that coming up on this episode of DOGE Watch. Okay, so first things first, let's get into something that was retweeted out by DOGE having to do with NIH. So this is the tweet that was put out and retweeted by DOGE. It says, last year, $9 billion of the $35 billion that the National Institutes of Health granted for research was used for administrative overhead, what is known as indirect costs. Today, NIH lowered the maximum indirect cost rate research institutions can charge the government to 15%, above what many major foundations allow, and much lower than the 60% that some institutions charge the government today. This change will save more than $4 billion a year, effective immediately. It says old NIH indirect rates, 69%, 67.5%, 63.7%. The new indirect rate, 15%. So again, what does this effectively do? Well, first of all, understand something. It's not just NIH. The amount of money that the federal government sends to institutions of higher education every year is mind-boggling. If you look at the entire amount of funding that gets shifted from state, local, and federal governments to higher education, it's something like almost $1 trillion a year, somewhere along that line. And a lot of that is in things like tuition assistance grants, or it might be direct funding for infrastructure projects or whatever it is. It kind of varies based off of whether or not it's state, local, or federal. But a lot of the federal money that goes to these institutions is in the form of research grants. So you can imagine how this is a huge boon for higher education, because now they're not just collecting money from things like tuition or tuition assistance or college loans, but they're also getting a ton of money in the form of research grants. And you can imagine how some of these research grants are absolutely ridiculous. In fact, Rand Paul does a good job of talking about some of the stupid stuff that we fund every year. But these ones specifically through NIH, you can imagine an environment where it might be appropriate for the federal government to finance some research. Maybe it's research associated with dealing with, outbreaks or things of that nature. A reasonable person could argue that this might be a legitimate function of government or a legitimate spending function. But when you're spending this much in administrative costs, that's where people look at this and go, wait a second. If you were the private sector, you would never get away with this much administrative overhead. So why does the government get away with it? Well, a couple of reasons. First, like we said in the last episode, this is how people end up getting really, really good jobs for their buddies, right? Is they bake in all these additional administrative costs that have nothing to do with the actual research to be conducted, but it provides for a lot of additional jobs, which then provides for, again, more kickbacks to politicians, sometimes in the form of campaign contributions. Other times it might just be ideological alignment. Politicians want their woke buddies to get additional jobs, and so they allow for additional administrative overhead. This is going to significantly reduce that, which is incredibly important, because I know personally, I get very frustrated about the amount of money that is sent to higher education every year, because if there's been one institution in the country that has been, in my opinion, the most responsible for pushing woke ideology on the rest of the country, it has been higher ed. And so we should scrutinize these contracts going to them, because higher education already gets enough of our tax dollars. If they're actually going to provide a service for the government, which is legitimate, well, then they should be held to a high standard with respect to the administrative costs associated with that. So I think this is a good move by DOGE, good move by NIH. It's the sort of thing that needs to be replicated through contracts across the board. Let's go into this next one here that I wanted to address. This was on February 7th. In the past 48 hours, HHS canceled 62 contracts worth $182 million. These contracts were entirely for administrative expenses. None touched any healthcare programs. This included terminating a $168,000 contract for an anti-Fauci exhibit at the NIH museum. Now, think about this for a second, right? The massive amount of federal debt, with the massive amount of federal deficit spending, what do politicians always get up and say when there's any sort of cuts to something like Health and Human Services or National Institute for Health? They always say things like, people are going to die. You're cutting necessary funding for critical healthcare programs and organizations and whatever else it is. And then you find out that $182 million of it was associated with just pure administrative expenses. Now, I think most of us can understand that there's some level of administrative costs that might be associated with something. But when it's this level, here's what I'm willing to bet we're all going to discover. I'm willing to bet we're all going to discover that with $182 million in purely administrative expenses being cut, none of us are going to see major drops off in services associated with these critical programs. None of us. And again, this is why one of the most important things to understand about the bureaucracy is the bureaucracy's job is ultimately to grow itself and to protect its budget. So the reason for this is because when you're the head of a bureaucratic agency, right, what goes on your resume is how big the agency was, what sort of impact it had, and what your budget was. That's how you get graded. Now, you look at the private sector. They may mention those things, but what you're actually graded for in the private sector is profits. Now, profits in the private sector are generally associated with how good a job did you do at effectively and efficiently providing goods and services to people who could choose not to do business with you, right? And then produce a profit at the end, both for the benefit of your company and for the benefit of your shareholders, right? You have to take care of your customers in order to generate that kind of revenue, increase your budgets, increase staff and everything else. And the private sector is constantly looking for efficiencies. Not so with government bureaucracies. If you want a perfect example of this, go to Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell, who once upon a time was actually a dedicated Marxist, and says that the thing that cured him of that was not studying under Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago. It was one summer working for a federal bureaucracy and realizing that they had a vested interest not in what the stated objective of their organization was, but in protecting the funding that they controlled. And so if that meant using the funding in a way that was actually damaging to the people that they were supposed to be helping, they would do it if it meant protecting their budgets. So understand something. The narrative that we're going to hear from the left, whenever you cut funding from something like Health and Human Services, is going to be, oh my gosh, people are going to die. Until you realize that all of us are better off if $182 million is not being wasted on administrative costs that weren't necessary, right? This is going to be a common theme that I bring up in probably every DOGE episode. Every time DOGE cuts dollars, the left is going to respond, oh, that's less money for people in need, or that's firing critical government employees, right? These funds is disappearing. These jobs are disappearing. No, the funds will now be reallocated from something that was wasteful to something that is productive, either in the form of giving the money back to the taxpayers who earned it or reallocating it towards something that's actually a legitimate and useful government function instead of waste. And so we always need to remember, as soon as they start complaining about dollars being gone or jobs being lost. No. It's wasteful dollars being recovered and jobs that shouldn't have existed in the first place going away so that jobs that should exist now have the funding necessary. So what DOGE is doing here is really, really important. And again, I congratulate them on all of this work. There's a couple other things I want to mention here, and this is to kind of get us prepared for what's going to happen in the future. Because right now, DOGE has done an excellent job as establishing itself by going after funding that the vast majority of the population will look at and say, yep, that makes sense. I don't want hundreds of millions of dollars going to DEI programs to a military junta in Burma. I don't want a bunch of my dollars going to overhead and administrative costs when it's not necessary and it's doing nothing but propping up higher ed. I don't want my money going to bureaucratic positions that shouldn't exist within the government, because that means that taxpayers have less money because they're having to prop up parasitic positions within the government. Now, this has all been pretty easy so far because of what DOGE has targeted. But just imagine it's going to get a little bit more difficult when DOGE targets things like the Department of Education. Because just like when they target HHS, it's like, oh my gosh, you want sick people to die. When they target Department of Education, it's going to be, oh my gosh, you don't want poor kids to learn. What's important to understand is that when you look at the Department of Education and the 4,400 employees that it has, when you look at all the money it's spending on a variety of programs, again, these dollars are not just failing to produce better test results or failing to produce a better educational environment for our kids. They're actually being actively used to indoctrinate kids through these federal programs, which comes with all these strings attached in order to get the money. So when people are asking you, okay, Nick, I'm happy what they're doing with DEI. I'm happy what they're doing with some of the immigration stuff and all of that. But my gosh, don't we need the Department of Education to ensure that poor people get educated? The answer is no. Getting rid of the Department of Education will improve education quality in this country. Because again, we're going to recover all of that money that is currently not just being wasted or spent in a way that many of us would find wasteful. It's actively being spent to indoctrinate our kids on things we don't want. So it's not just that we recover the funds, we stop the funds from being used for negative outcomes. So don't buy into the narrative that you're going to hear. I already have people calling me up going, Nick, what does this mean for this program? Or what does it mean for that program? I can tell you right now, we are fully capable of being able to fund federal programs for disabled children without having a massive federal bureaucracy on top of all the other massive federal bureaucracies that we have. We don't need to create an agency of 4,400 people to send money from one location to another location. That is not required. And so, again, part of what this show is about is prepping you for the arguments that you're going to hear and equipping you with the arguments that you need to respond with. Now, there's one other thing that I want to address tonight, and I think this is really important. DOGE is moving super fast, and I'm grateful for it. I want DOGE to move very fast. I want the federal government and the Trump administration to move fast. I don't want them to be constantly bogged down by a bureaucracy that I know is actively working against them. However, there is a danger, and I just want to point this out. One of the things that career bureaucrats are very good at doing is covering their own rear. And they noticed at this point that things are now moving in a very different direction. They woke up one day and realized, oh, this isn't like previous Republican administrations where they talked a good game, but then did nothing about it. This is an administration that is serious, and I better get on board one way or another. Now, we already saw the first major instance of malicious compliance. That is where you had somebody that pretended like they were complying with Pete Hegseth's command to get rid of these DEI programs, but in actuality was cutting things that had nothing to do with DEI, but would make Pete look bad. They were trying to give talking points to Democrats and talking points to opponents of DOGE to make it look like, oh, see, DOGE is actually preventing this course on the Tuskegee Airmen. Now, we know that's false because as soon as Pete Hegseth learned about it, he immediately reinstituted the program. And I hope, I haven't heard yet, but I hope he fired the person that tried to get rid of it because they were engaging in malicious compliance. So that's one thing that we're going to have to be very careful of. There's going to be another side of this, though, that's important. And that is you're going to have people that make decisions, right, that come back to bite them. And instead of taking responsibility for the decisions, they're going to immediately try to pass the buck onto somebody else. And again, bureaucrats and attorneys are really good at this. Now, I've seen this at the local level where you will have attorneys that essentially let's just say, thwart the objectives of the elected, the people put into elected positions. They thwart those objectives by essentially engaging in legalese or telling them that they should do one course of action or another course of action in order to avoid litigation, right? And then when the people go out and execute that, and people ask, why did you do that? The attorney is the last one to be found. Like, oh, I don't know. I was just providing legal advice. So what we need to be very, very aware of is when things come out and they say, oh my gosh, this person did this or this organization did that. We need to make sure it's true, because there are going to be cases where we need to call people out for what they did and to make sure they get fired. There's going to be other times where things get lost in the sauce and the wrong person is getting called out. So just be cognizant of the fact that one of the ways that the entrenched bureaucracy will protect itself is by giving you the wrong target. Now, there was an incident that happened with FEMA recently here, and a lot of people were understandably furious for it, and they should be furious about it. What we saw was an example of government dollars that were being used for NGOs and nonprofits to be able to facilitate sheltering immigrants. And there's a lot of nonprofits out there, to include organizations like Catholic Charities, that have made a ton of money essentially facilitating illegal immigration, all in the name of just helping people, right? And this was something that, again, millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars have been distributed in order to do. And people are furious because this last one came out and it's like, why is FEMA still approving funds in order to shelter illegal immigrants, right? This seems like it's helping sanctuary cities. The problem was this. The particular funding that was being discussed was actually not FEMA funds. It was CPB funds, Customs and Border, or CBP, Customs and Border Patrol funds. So these had been allocated by Congress, right? The funding was taken from them to be used through FEMA in order to support all of these various organizations, right? They were supposed to cut that funding off. The problem was that because Congress had allocated some of that funding, there was limited jurisdiction on what they could cut off and what they couldn't. So there was certain funding that continued to go out to they stopped it with the nonprofits, but then there was an injunction that was leveled that said that the funding that had been allocated by Congress to state and local governments for that purpose still had to go out there. And so FEMA was legally required to cut the checks. Now, don't get me wrong, I think it's a horrible program. But one of the things that's very important here is that we need to make sure that we're assigning blame appropriately. So there's a whole new administration in FEMA who, quite frankly, are doing excellent work. You want to talk about some of the people that are most on board with what DOGE is trying to do? It's these guys, right? There's other people that are trying to protect kind of things that they've done in the past or things that they didn't catch. So again, let's properly assign blame to the people that are doing the wrong thing. Let's also not let previous Congresses off the hook with respect to things they authorized during continuing resolutions. This is another thing we need to be very careful about. One of the best things that Elon Musk did is when Speaker Johnson was trying to push that continuing resolution at the end of last year, and they were pushing it based off of, well, this is going to be money for the border. This is going to be money to, for immigration reform. This is going to be, okay, but you were also trying to allocate a bunch of money that was going out as a part of previous budgets and previous continuing resolutions that was designed to do the exact opposite of what the American people asked for. And thankfully, through X, we were able to rally people very quickly, very effectively to shut down that continuing resolution. All right. But again, if you know anything about elected officials, they are very good at passing the buck off to somebody else. So one of the problems that we have going on with FEMA right now needs to be understood. We got a new administration that's just come in. They are trying to do the right thing. Some of what they are contending with is stuff that Congress authorized, Congress directed. And now we have legal battles that are currently going on. So let's make sure that we are standing by the people that are trying to do the right thing in an organization, right? And let's not let people that were doing the wrong thing get away with shedding off blame to other people. That's going to be a very important part of this process going forward. Because if we don't do that, if we allow the bureaucracy or if we allow certain elected officials who are squishes to cast the blame off to new people that Trump has brought in to try to fix these organizations, that is going to gum up the works really, really badly, right? So I just want to throw that out there as a cautionary tale. We need to work quickly. We need to work effectively, but we also need to understand, just like the examples we already have of the bureaucracy trying to protect itself through malicious compliance, we're also going to have elements of Congress and the bureaucracy trying to pass the buck in the form of diverting attention from the decisions they made by then blaming the people that were responsible for executing those decisions. So that's an important distinction that needs to be made if we're going to do this right. Because one of the best ways that bureaucracy protects itself is it tries to get everyone focused on the people that are actually working with us and make them the bad guy. So let's just be careful in how we analyze all of that. All right, that's our brief overview for what DOGE has been doing here in the last week. We got some more exciting stuff coming up. We're going to be actually talking to some members of Congress here in the next several weeks that are responsible for working the legislative side of what DOGE is going to be doing. So we're going to explain how that process works. Again, a lot of what DOGE has done up to this point, we've been able to do through the executive branch, and that's awesome. That's exactly where the focus should be. Take out all the low-hanging fruit that you possibly can through executive action. However, the long-term structural stuff that we're going to need to accomplish, a lot of it's going to require to Congress. And so we're going to talk to the members of Congress that are going to be responsible for working with DOGE in order to make that happen. And we want to do that because, again, we want to find who are our genuine allies within Congress, and we want to elevate them, right? We want to make sure that they are getting appreciation and recognition for the work that they're doing so that we can also identify the people that are not working with DOGE, right? We want to identify the bureaucrats that are working with DOGE, the people that Trump has brought in to reform these organizations. We want to recognize the allies in the House and the Senate who are also working with these agencies. We want to recognize the different think tanks that have been on board with this effort for years before DOGE was ever conceived of. We want to elevate those guys, and we want to find the squishes and make sure that they get an option. You can either get on board or you can find another career. Thank you very much for watching DOGE Watch. We'll be back next week with another episode. And as always, continue to follow us on X and follow DOGE as well. Go over to the official DOGE site on X. Follow them for constant updates. They're moving so quick. We're probably going to have to increase the number of episodes that we do per week. And again, that is a wonderful problem to have because I think all of us were sick and tired of being told that nothing can be done. We want things done. We want them done quickly. And we want to make sure we protect the people that are actually working with DOGE to make it possible. Once again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.